Hello, and as you may or may not know, I have been creating an outfit specifically from the years 1905 to 1906. And so I thought today we might look at the fashions of that era, the time when the suffragettes turned militant, the hyper-feminine woman of 1905 with her poofy hair and her fancy hat with feathers and all her lace and her tiny waist and the jutting out behind the S-shaped curve, this swan-like woman, all these images from the era with her doe eyes and gentle face. The tension between that and the suffragette movement, which at this point exactly in 1905 became militant, became violent, was brutally suppressed. So on the 13th of October 1905 at a political rally, two women, Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenney, interrupted a political meeting in Manchester to demand if any of the candidates, which included a young Winston Churchill, would give women the vote. And then they unfurled a banner saying "Votes for Women" and were subsequently arrested. And up to that moment, there had been a movement for votes of women that had been peaceable, a suffragist movement. And the suffragettes embraced the slogan, "Deeds, not words," and chained themselves to railings. Some of them carried bombs. They were pretty brutally treated in return by police and the judicial system. So we have in fashion this extraordinary tension between these extremely feminine women with their fabulous hats with feathers and lots of lace, and this really brutal treatment on the other side of that. So many women didn't actually conform to this image of soft femininity. They fought for the rights of women, and it was a pretty brutal fight. They also used fashion to promote their cause. We can't think of the suffragettes without thinking of the suffragette colours of violet, white and green. While both these magazines were published in 1905, they're aimed at a very different readership. Our Home magazine is for the working and middle class women who sew to own clothes, while this Paris Fashions magazine is for the high society lady who might have changed her clothes 5 or 6 times a day. And if we open it up, we see advertisements for dressmakers and restaurants and tailors. Looking at the fashions, we see these very broad-brimmed hats held aloft by big hair, very puffy sleeves, these ruffly bodices that then flare out into this bell-shaped skirt, which for women of this high society class might have a train as well. These high society women can afford more expensive fabrics and adornments and more intricate dresses made for them by dressmakers, and they often had very high necks fastened at the back with up to 15 tiny buttons, so they also required the services of a lady's maid. We can see how the fullness of this bell-shaped skirt balance the puffy sleeves and the large ornate hats on top of that very fluffy hairdo. And we also see the pigeon-breasted shape. This was the time of the S-curve. So blouses were puffed out towards the waistline, which was emphasised with a little pointy cummerbund. And aren't the little bows on this dress pretty at the sleeves and then echoed on the skirt? And we also see very frilled puffy sleeves and the shape then balanced by the bell shape of the skirt. And if we look at these contemporary portraits at the time, we see how these illustrations are brought to life. Look at that lingerie dress with its layers of lace, and over the dress you might wear an ornate coat. Petticoats had ruffles, pin tucks and lace and were often tied to the waist by a drawstring, which allowed fabric to be pulled around towards the behind. Corsets created the S-curve and were supposed to be healthier than Victorian hourglass ones since they put less pressure on the waist. And there were wonderful embellishments to clothes in Edwardian times, especially for these high society women. Look at those rose appliques and the deep scalloped lace. The ruffly bodice and bell-shaped hats would have all looked a bit top-heavy, but for this bell-shaped skirt nipped in at the waist. And the bell shape was achieved by cutting the skirt in gauze, usually with more fabric towards the back. And for more formal occasions, there might be a small train at the back too. And we can see why this era is also known as La Belle Époque, the beautiful era, or the Golden Age, because women's fashions took on like a new extravagance at this time, inspired by the rather party lifestyle of Britain's King Edward VII. And these leg of mutton sleeves were a really popular shape, especially on walking suits, and women went out with all accessories, including an umbrella and gloves too, of course. And women were more active at this time, and the walking suit became popular, also beautifully adorned. And look at this wonderful striped dress, and we see in photographs of the time how that decoration is echoed. And I thought I would include an example of an Edwardian man. And here we are onto these wonderful wide fancy hats worn tilted over the forehead in this case. But there were lots of hat styles to choose from in the Edwardian era, as long as they were wide and fancy, with ribbons, lace and feathers. And with all this beauty, we have to mention the Gibson girl. The Gibson girl was drawn by the American Charles Dana Gibson. Previously, most beauty ideals had emanated from Europe, but the Gibson girl was an American ideal of beauty and based initially on his wife and sisters. The Gibson girl had a perfect oval face, a cottage loaf hairdo and a superior attitude towards men. She was also, of course, young, white and beautiful, but at least she did represent a strong ideal of womanhood, being independent and active, even sporty. And when I say cottage loaf hairdo, just in case you wonder what I mean, I've included a little illustration of a loaf of bread, a cottage loaf of bread, so you can see how the hair was put up, often with the help of false hair, padding, to achieve this cottage loaf shape, which was absolutely distinctive of the Gibson girl. And you can see her here drawn by Charles Dana Gibson, but with that slightly superior look that was also her trademark, along with her beauty. When we come towards the end of the video, I'll show you ordinary girls of the Edwardian time who were obviously dressing and doing their hair in ways to emulate the Gibson girl. And actually, the clothes she wore are very wearable, or the clothes associated with the Gibson girl are very wearable. This sort of lacy blouse with a bow tied at the neckline, still really very wearable and pretty today. And the illustration on the left, of course, giving women directions on how to achieve this hairdo, which was actually necessary in order to hold up those rather fancy wide-brimmed hats that they wore. And the colours fashionable at this time were bright pastel or flower colours, as we can see in these magazine illustrations too, although a rather beautiful and daring lady is wearing scarlet and black. And just to show you more magazine covers, because I think they were beautiful in this era, and a lady getting into the bath, because of course this was the era that saw dedicated bathrooms rather than a tub in front of the fire. And it was also an era of seeing cars on the road, and of course people now had electric lights. So there were all kinds of ways that the Edwardians and us have much in common. And turning to the page to look at hats, we see these wide-brimmed hats, and I've included a picture of a suffragette also wearing one of these hats, where you can see how these illustrations from high fashion magazines, how they permeated through to ordinary women too, although saying that, of course, a lot of suffragettes were high society women. And now we're on to our home magazine. Now, this magazine purports to be for women of the working and middle classes who sewed their own clothes, and we indeed see advertisements not for dressmakers but for fabrics. And going by the courtship column at the end of the magazine, the readership was actually largely made up of girls in service, although there's plenty of high society gossip. And here we come to the walking suits, so popular with women of all classes, and you can see those leg of mutton sleeves there. And here we are, these wonderful photographs which I was able to find in my local library, and they were all taken in 1905 and 1906 by an amateur photographer who enjoyed taking these photographs of women walking around the streets of West London, just going about their daily business. And they are just the most wonderful thing that I found. I think they bring to life how ordinary women wore these clothes that look so fancy in magazines, but on them just look very pretty and ordinary in the best possible way. And I think it makes them feel much closer to us, and also can inspire us about how we might like to take Edwardian elements into our own clothes. You can see this girl in a walking suit, has a bow at her neckline, as influenced by the Gibson girl, and another lady in a walking suit who looks like she's saying, "Why are you photographing me?" And here we have this wonderful magazine cover and a deep red walking suit. And now we're on to the blouses. Now, these are not fashionable clothes for sale. These are a dress pattern, and this is showing 3 different versions of the same dress pattern. But in this girl, also taken by the same photographer, and this lady with her wonderful ruffle blouse, we can see how these patterns for blouses translated to wonderful clothes for the ordinary women of the time. And of course, even for ordinary women, very ruffled, puffy sleeves are still a thing. And look at hers, I think she looks absolutely wonderful. All these ruffly blouses, so pretty. And here we have a group of women out and about in their ruffly blouses. And I love that view from the back where you can see the fabric has been gathered to form that S-curve, and actually how pretty it could look. And you can also see the little lace-up boots, those Edwardian boots that actually I have a pair myself, a copy from Memory Shoes, who do lovely copies of Edwardian lace-up ankle boots, which are a bit of a thing to put on, but you can walk for hours in them and they're really comfy. So such a wearable look. And just turning over, there is the hair advertisements. But interestingly, in this magazine, there is a lot written about the suffragette movement, very supportively, and referring to how it's going in all kinds of different countries. And on the right, dress patterns for a nightgown, and here we have a pattern for embroidery and more hints on practical dressmaking, a lot of advertisements for different fabrics, a nice romantic short story. Then we're on to more about the suffragette movements. So It shows how widespread this was, and the cupboard shelf, all kinds of ideas for storing food, which of course the high society women, they wouldn't have been bothered with that. No, others to do it for them. And here a millinery lesson for how to decorate your own hat. I rather thought that woman in the right looked like she might have made her own hat, and just showing you how you could just add your own big ostrich feather to it. And the Gibson girl was active and sporty, as we see in this gym wear. And look at these wonderful bathing beauties. I love their stockings so much. I had to do a little close-up of those spotty and checky stockings. And here are the idealised Gibson girls looking rather superior. And then the ordinary girls who might have sort of emulated the Gibson girls, but actually wanted to have a good time. And then we turn over to the courtship column, which is full of the romantic problems experienced by young women who are in service, very much like this girl seen scrubbing the steps outside a grand South Kensington home in West London. And now I thought I might show you just a few details that I've picked out from Edwardian clothes that I particularly like. And on the right, I just wanted to draw your attention to the neckline and the cuffs. And then on the left, that fabulous layers of scalloped lace. And here I love the way that the girl on the right with her ruffly sleeves, you'd look at the woman on the left, wouldn't you, and think, oh, I'd never wear that. And then you look at the woman on the right and you think, oh, maybe I would. I love how these street scenes actually translate high fashion into real life. And here's a trend I also think is so wearable, with that high little Peter Pan collar and then the little narrow knotted tie over the puffy blouse and perhaps a boater or a tam o' shanter. I think that is such a wearable look today and very pretty, actually rather Anne of Green Gables. And then I loved all these different shirt fronts. I love the one on the left, the contrast fabric, and then the little bow at the neckline in the middle, and then the ruffled yoke on the right, and each with their wide-brimmed hat. But I thought all those three girls are wearing looks that we white well want to wear today too. And I love the tucks all the way down from the top of the skirt, and just another look at those amazing cuffs and neckline. And now we see another side of the Belle Epoque, women's fight for the vote. And this was brutal at times. This is a suffragette lying on the ground after being attacked by a policeman. We have suffragettes looking the worse for wear in Holloway prison. Some went on hunger strike and were force-fed using these very barbaric and upsetting means. But they supported each other and they were active in many different countries. Here we see them campaigning in London and now in New York with a rather wonderful scene of the baby in the pushchair. And again, these women were determined and courageous, and I think we should remember them. And I think that we can also see the influence of the fashions of the time and their cottage loaf hairdos and high neck lacy blouses. And I thought I would finish by reading you a problem from the courtship column, written by a woman very much like the one that you see before you. And she writes, I would feel very much obliged if you would advise me. I've been introduced to two young men. I've fallen in love with one of them. I often see him and stop and speak to him. He seems to be very nice, but I don't think he understands that I really love him. I'm very fond of his company, but I do not know whether he is fond of mine. What would you advise me to do to gain his affection? I should be very pleased to receive an answer. And the answer is, you can do nothing but just be ordinarily polite. You would not like to be considered fast and forward, would you? And that would not make you desirable in his eyes. Full stop. That was all she got.
Rather makes you feel for him too, doesn't it? Like, how would he know if his affections were returned?
So I very much hope that you enjoyed looking at the fashions of 1905, this fascinating era for women's fashion and for women's history. And if you did enjoy it, I'd really appreciate you giving this video a like, and of course consider subscribing, and I shall look forward to seeing you next week. Bye. If you didn't conform to that vision of the super feminine